Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Michael Feldstein, Chief Accountability Officer at e-Literate. Michael has a strong background in both K-12 and post-secondary education, including being a partner at MindWires Consulting, Senior Program Manager of MindTap at Cengage Learning, and Principal Product Strategy Manager for Academic Enterprise Solutions. Michael's latest passion is higher ed and technology in higher ed, and he joins us today to talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how it can help and hurt higher ed institutions. Michael, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Drumm. It's a pleasure to be here today.
I'm looking forward to our conversation. We're going to go into that big, bad, ugly topic called artificial intelligence, which is driving higher ed institutions crazy, at least from what you read in the publications, because they're concerned about a whole host of things. We're going to get down to the truth of that today, of what's really important and what folks need to be aware of. Before we get there, tell us a little bit about yourself. You're an expert in so many different areas around AI and machine learning. How'd you get here? What's your background?
Well, I'd actually say that I'm not an expert in any area. I'm a jack of all trades and master of none. I am a teacher from a family of teachers, even though I haven't been in the classroom in decades. I always approach everything from an educator's perspective. I happen to have a love of technology and a particular passion for thinking through the process of teaching and of educating, which I grew up talking about around our kitchen table and thinking through how new technologies can be useful in serving the mission and the process of education. So my interests and knowledge of different technologies, including artificial intelligence, have always evolved as new opportunities have come along, but I would call myself a passionate amateur when it comes to artificial intelligence and more of a professional educator who can translate between the two groups.
Spoken very well, thank you. And we came to know each other through Phil Hill, who is an expert in OPM. And my perspective is if Phil recommended you, you're the man.
Phil and I blogged together for 8 or 9 years, and we consulted together for 7. He's an old friend and a really smart guy.
He really is. So let's get into the topic today, artificial intelligence, AI. What is AI? I mean, we've read so much in the news lately. What is it? Explain it to us laymen's who, we can look at a computer and go, oh, that does things, but have no idea how it does it.
Right. So let's just briefly mention, without getting into the technical details, that there are really 2 families of algorithms that we're interested in. One is called machine learning, which is a cousin of artificial intelligence, ML and AI. We're not going to make too much of a distinction between the two today because that really wouldn't serve the audience and it can send us down some rabbit holes. But the basic commonality between the two is that they're algorithms that we design them how to evolve themselves without specific instruction. For example, back in the days when your spam filter wasn't run by Google or your email service, but you had a plugin, it would learn how to get better at recognizing email that was spam for you or not spam for you, even though you didn't tell it explicitly what about the email might allow it to recognize that the email was spam. You just said this is spam or it isn't.
Mm-hmm. So what you're talking about is I'll get an email, $250,000 approved for financing, et cetera. And I'll go, I'll click on this and say, junk mail. Mm-hmm. And it goes in there. Is that what you're talking about?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And it gets it wrong sometimes, right? But it gets better over time. And it gets better over time without us telling it, well, I noticed that this came from a weird email address, even though it says Bank of America on it. The spam filter just knows that you've scored this as spam, even though it looks like it's not spam to the spam filter. So it will go through all the different parameters and figure out which parameter, which aspect makes this email look suspicious, and it will adjust it so that the next time an email comes in that has a suspicious looking email, it'll be more like it'll be more likely to flag that email as spam.
Mm-hmm. So that's machine learning, that's AI, or both?
It's both. The difference, and again, I am not a technical expert on AI, but I know enough to tell you that that is a feature common in the two. AI often adds layers of complexity in terms of how it teaches itself, how the software is written to evolve, that machine learning does not have. An example of this that we'll get into a bit later when we talk about ChatGPT is in type ahead. On your phone, you might start typing a word and it's going to guess the word that you want to complete, or in your word processor, it might even guess the phrase or the sentence that you're trying to complete. And that is all machine learning and artificial intelligence too. And that actually can get quite complex and interesting ways that bridge the gap from machine learning into artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense because the machine, the intelligence, is having to learn based on what it's observed without giving you specific directions. I can think about when I bought my last car, the dealer said, don't hit the brakes really hard for the first 500 miles or something like that. And I was curious as to why. And he said, the car is going to learn how you generally brake. And so it will adjust over time. If you hit the brakes really hard in something that's not an emergency, then that car is going to start thinking that that is your normal braking pattern, and it's going to adjust itself to that. That's AI, isn't it?
Yes, and I think what comes out in that example are two real critical factors in understanding the limitations, some of the limitations of how good machine learning and AI can be. One is data, right? So if you started driving that car and you decided that the first thing you were going to do is teach your 16-year-old child how to drive, and you were going to put that kid in the driver's seat, and there was a lot of herky-jerky slamming on the brakes, well, the car is going to work from those data, right? So the algorithm for the braking is going to adjust only based on the data that you give it, right? The other aspect is that the person who designed that algorithm had to be thinking about different aspects to tell the car to pay attention to. For example, are you on a hill? Are you going uphill or downhill? Is it tied into your GPS? Does it know whether you're at an intersection or not? All of those factors might influence the way it learns about your braking patterns, but only if the programmer tells it in advance to pay attention to those details. Just like a spam filter might notice that most spam comes on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, but only if the developer of the spam filter tells it to look at the day of the week.
But that is really helpful for me putting it in context as to how complex this actually is. I mean, it depends on not only the programmer, obviously, with that, but it also depends on the information that it will gather based on what the programmer tells it to look at.
Yes. These are incredibly powerful tools. We can do all kinds of crazy new things that we couldn't do with them before. And just like tools we've been creating since the beginning of time, the wheel, the inclined plane, the pulley, right? They have very specific uses and explanations and limitations. And the better that we understand how they work, the better we'll be able to know what they're good for and what they're not so good for.
Mm-hmm. Which really brings us to the next topic we were going to talk about is AI is a tool. It's, I love Shakespeare's quote, nothing is good or bad, it's thinking that makes it so.
Right.
And so AI is good, AI is bad. It depends on how you think of it. But in essence, it's really a tool. What are some of the problems that could be useful in solving from an education perspective?
Right. So let's talk about a couple of teaching and learning problems, just a couple of quick examples, and then maybe broaden out a little bit to the way the university itself runs and some other important aspects. Within teaching and learning, for example, Google has demonstrated that we already know that they have an algorithm that can take a poorly worded search phrase and interpret it and say, well, I think what you mean is this, so I'm going to give you good results. So it's very good at understanding meaning for at least short phrases. We also know that there are these software applications called plagiarism detectors that go out and say, well, this looks a lot like this other source and so much like it that it might be copied from that other source, right? Well, if you combine those two together, you have a pretty good tool for evaluating whether students are giving a good paraphrase, right? Are they going too far and copying the text? Or are they interpreting the text in a way that gets away from its original meaning? Or are they getting that sweet spot in the middle? A second educational application has as much to do with us as educators as it does with students. We all know that sometimes we teach students, we don't reach them, they don't learn, and maybe in some classes there's a pattern to how those students don't learn. And it can be hard for the human educator to catch those systematic errors that the students are made. But if you have well-written questions with a well-written learning objective, and you have software that's analyzing the students' patterns of answers, multiple students' patterns of answers, we can not only learn whether a student is progressing towards competency, towards understanding the learning objective, and where they might get stuck, but we can also begin to determine if maybe there's a problem with a course design, that students tend to get stuck on a particular topic, and that we can do a better job of teaching it. If we step back more broadly, we can use these technologies to, for example, identify students early who might be in danger of dropping out because they've missed a week of class or two, which by itself might or might not be a red flag, but we also know that they work 2 jobs and commute to campus. And if you combine that information, which is just a combination of data that the average person might not catch, we can begin to discover the patterns of those students at a particular institution who are likely to drop out. Likewise, we can use that information to respond to students. This is a really big thing right now for the use of chatbots in universities, where we can begin to see if a student is struggling in a way that might prevent them from registering or getting on campus or passing their class or staying in, getting financial aid they need, right? They'll ask a question, often poorly, the way we might phrase a web search term. And the software can do a really good job of helping the students find the right answers. And then for questions that really need a human to answer them, direct the students to the humans who can be helpful to them. So we're taking our student support professionals and we're making sure they're really responding to students who need them, as opposed to those students who just need a quick answer.
You've brought up 3 really good examples of how AI can be used. One is assessing student learning outcomes, including redesigning courses, things along those lines. Student services, starting to identify students who are slipping behind or potential to slip behind, maybe even before they start slipping, by being able to recognize patterns. And then the ability to reach out to students via chatbots, which my own personal thing is the ones that I've been seeing out there are pretty useless, but, I'm sure they'll improve. AI will teach itself, right? But, to be able to reach out to students, before or when they start needing help to be able to have. So those are three really good examples.
Let me add a fourth one, since you brought up chatbots and our question about how useful they are or they are not. Very often, when we are trying to understand how well those chatbots are really working, we'll use some sophisticated statistical analysis. If we're doing a research project, for example, is this effective or not? That statistical analysis may not be very far away from the algorithm that you need to inform the chatbot to learn how to get better, right? You'll begin to measure certain parameters. It matters how quickly the student gets a response. Certain kinds of responses, the chatbot has better success at moving student achievement or action than others, right? And once we begin to gain those insights through the research, we can begin to automate some of that insight to continue to refine itself.
Mm-hmm. Your explanations are just lighting sparks inside my brain going, well, what about maintenance in buildings and plant equipment and things like that? You could easily start to see these kind of things. I hate to say it, but I'm going to. The possibilities are endless or nearly endless. You do need the human in the thing to be able to make certain decisions. But I think even strategic planning.
Yes.
If you've got, it requires good data. The data's got to be organized in the right way. But AI could find patterns that a normal person would miss, maybe around enrollment or something along those lines.
And the term of art, which you brought up a very important point, which is very often the best use of machine learning and artificial intelligence is not to replace the human, but to augment the human. And so the term of art is human in the loop.
Okay. That's a new one for me.
Yes.
I mean, it's just amazing. We've seen so much negative hype. I haven't seen anybody talking about the positive aspects of this. And I'm specifically speaking to ChatGPT because, oh my God, students are going to be able to, there's so much fear and hype. Students are going to be able to plagiarize all their papers. Right. Why is it getting so much attention?
Well, I think one of the reasons is that ChatGPT, and I mean this in a neutral sense, I don't mean to denigrate, but ChatGPT is a toy. And what I mean by that is it invites play. It's very easy for anyone who is not a technologist to try it, to experiment, to learn how to get better at getting better results, to learn what it's good at and what it's not good at. So ChatGPT has improved tremendously, in part because it's getting all these data from all the usage. People can ask it anything, so they do ask it anything. And the creators are learning what people will ask it and what it's good at and what it's not. And one example that might surprise you is that ChatGPT is terrible at math.
Really?
This is a program that has billions of parameters. It's one of the most complex software programs, and by the way, expensive and carbon-intensive programs on the planet.
Okay.
But what it really is at its heart is a very, very, very sophisticated version of your type ahead that you use in your word processor. And I'm oversimplifying here, but the basic idea is, well, okay, if I can guess the next letter you type might be a C if the letter you just typed is an S, but it won't be a C if it's an X, right? And I can guess that if the word you typed was school, that the next word you might type is bus, but it probably won't be chicken. And then
unless we're talking mascots.
We might be talking mascots. All right, it's not impossible, right? And you can think about this in terms of letters, words, phrases, sentences, entire paragraphs. Keep in mind that ChatGPT was trained on a big slice of the internet and a lot of books. So it can look across very large swaths of text. If you're talking about cellular mitosis, for example, it's read, so to speak, a lot about that topic, and it can anticipate all kinds of combinations of words and sentences and ideas that might come together on that. So it can give you responses that are spooky. They sound like ChatGPT really understands the question that you're asking and is giving you an intelligent, insightful answer, even though what it's done is it's boiled down a lot of information from the internet and is just rearranging it in ways that are so complex that we can't even follow exactly what it's doing. Math, on the other hand, is a very simple and very deterministic process. So figuring out how to take a function as simple as a basic calculator, not even a scientific calculator, but a basic calculator, and attach it to something that works like ChatGPT turns out to be surprisingly hard. There was a news story about how ChatGPT couldn't do math, and then the people who created it came out and said, well, we fixed that. And just last week, I went on and I asked ChatGPT, how good are you at math? And it said, I'm pretty good. There are certain things I can't do, but I certainly can do basic arithmetic. And I asked it a basic arithmetic question using a couple of relatively long numbers. It was an addition problem, and it got the wrong answer. Now, maybe if I asked it today, it would get the right answer because the programmers are always working on it and the software is always learning. But it just shows you, if we understand ChatGPT as a tool, a very sophisticated tool, rather than as magic, then we can begin to understand, it makes sense that it wouldn't be good at math.
Well, that makes perfect sense to me. Those are some of the cons.
Yeah.
Something else we talked about was it's not predictable.
Yeah. So it was trained on the internet. And we know people say...
Which we all know is truthful, right?
Right. People say all kinds of things on the internet. And ChatGPT has been known for giving very confident wrong answers. Right. And that's bad enough when you're trying to find out the right answer. So when people are asking whether ChatGPT will replace search, again, search is designed as a different kind of tool, and making these two kinds of tools work together is challenging. When we start thinking about, and this is what really freaks educators out, when we start thinking about students using ChatGPT to write essays for them, one of the many problems that educators worry about is that ChatGPT will write an essay that is full of falsehoods or maybe even hateful or biased language, because it doesn't know any better unless we teach it otherwise.
It doesn't have a moral compass, is what you're telling me?
It doesn't. And actually, the folks who make it are working very hard to give it one. But because it's so complex a program, it's not entirely predictable.
And with the not predictable, that brings to mind the movie War Games with Matthew Broderick.
Yes.
Years ago, starting, would you like to play a game called Thermonuclear War?
Right.
So, hard to set rules, etc. But there are good things, and we've talked about some of those for higher ed. We, talked about its implications for teaching, for assessment, for student services, and even running plants. A lot of things there. Now, we're starting to see some of the platforms, Google has their Bard. Bing, Bing's been in the news lately about it named itself, and some of the crazier things. What are some of the things that you're anticipating that are going to happen with AI over the next, say 2 years?
Well, it's really difficult to predict because, as we've been discussing, sometimes these technologies can seem miraculous and really are miraculous. For all of the problems that ChatGPT has, I was a philosophy major in college, and just as an exercise, I had a really interesting conversation with it about the philosopher David Hume's understanding of what knowledge is. And I actually learned something from that conversation. So it can surprise us in positive ways and in negative ways. I like to talk about AI development in 3 stages. There's the miracle, the grind, and the wall. The miracle is when you have an experience with a new technology like ChatGPT, like I'm sure we'll get with Bard from Google, like we'll probably get with GPT-4, which will be the next version of the model that underlies ChatGPT, and other technologies that are different. Well, these chatbot-like models that we've been talking about, they're called large language models, and there are AI programs that work very differently from them. So each one will come with a miracle where we'll say, oh, that's going to change everything. And then we'll find, well, there are these little problems that it can't get math right. Well, that should be easy to fix. And then we go from miracle to grind because we discover, well, it's not easy to fix. And by the way, it's not really easy to do what developers call QA, quality assurance. How do you test to make sure you're going to get reliable right answers, which is really important when you're dealing with students' lives or their learning, right?
Or airplane software.
Or airplane software, or automatic driving, or there are lots of different applications where you can think that, if you get a bad search result, that's not nearly as bad as if you get a bad plane landing vector, right? So you go through the grind of trying to figure out how you can solve the problem, and then eventually, sometimes unpredictably, you'll hit a wall. So, for example, we will discover in certain kinds of learning applications, we have these grand aspirations for intelligent tutors and personal learning software. And it may turn out that, in fact, it has turned out that the data we have from the learning systems as they're built today are not the data that the software requires in order to be able to really understand student learning. So the whole system that is built, that this AI algorithm plugs into, is designed poorly for that kind of learning application, that software learning application, and needs to be rethought from scratch. That's the wall.
Yeah, and my brain just hit the wall because my jaw hit the desk and going, okay, so that means from a student services perspective, we need to go back and rethink how we've done student services, what's important. I mean, we've seen some institutions do this. The example, Amarillo College, Russell Lowry Hart, who's just an incredible visionary. He knows who his student population is. He knows what their limitations are and their challenges, and is able to bring those services in that are needed. That's rethinking how student services is done for a particular college. And it's not one size fits all. I mean, this works for his demographic, but another demographic, Harvard or Yale or something like that, would be totally different. So each institution's going to have to figure out what the parameters are, and that's that's the critical thinking aspect that's necessary, and then bring it into a ChatGPT, another AI platform, and be able to present the data that's really necessary to be able to analyze trends, et cetera. Does that make sense?
It does, and there's actually a third piece in the middle that you have to be thinking about too. So if I'm a human, I'm a counselor, I'm interacting with students, maybe I'm taking notes so that the next time the student calls, we have a record and we can respond to that student, right? What am I capturing in my notes about my interaction with the student? What am I not capturing? And am I capturing it in the way that under the hood in the way the software is designed, that information is machine readable so that an AI or machine learning or, data mining algorithm can actually make sense of it and do something with it. There's a lot of human context that we all understand intuitively that the software doesn't. So we have to make sure we're explicitly encoding for the machine to learn as well as the human to learn when we're recording our interactions with the students.
And that brings up an interesting point about, and we see this with certain programs right now, where it will take a audio transcript and convert it into text. This may be, and I'm guessing at this point, I mean, this is what we call a WAG, a wild you-know-what guess. That if you could record these conversations and then upload them in text or whatever the thing is, you could start to give the computer this kind of context. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think you and I agreed we're going to try something like this for this particular podcast. So you're going to give me a clean transcript. I'm going to write a prompt for ChatGPT asking it to summarize, and we will share with your audience both, we'll share the transcript, the prompt to ChatGPT, and the output. And we'll see how those things turn out. We'll see how good ChatGPT is with the input of the text and some prompting from me at producing a viable summary. We can imagine taking that further. I write a weblog called e-Literate, and I have a very idiosyncratic writing style and an idiosyncratic thinking style, but I've written a lot, and I would love to be able to point one of these algorithms at the thousands of posts I've written and see if it can capture not only the sentence structures, but also some of the thought patterns and the expressions and the actual thinking the way I think. I'm not looking for it to replace me. I'd just like to see if we can have a dialogue where I can find a like mind.
Well, you have a like mind in me. I don't know if you're going to have it in the AI, but I think that's going to be a wonderful experiment. Michael,
yes.
3 takeaways for university presidents and boards. What do they need to be thinking about with this stuff?
First is don't be overly afraid or overly excited. Focus on understanding. The second is always think about the human in the loop. You're not looking to automate. A university is a collection of knowledge workers, the ultimate knowledge workers, and you don't want to waste those big brains by having them conduct a lot of menial tasks that software can conduct. And the third is, there's that expression of a solution in search of a problem. I think we need to strike a balance between what that expression implies and the other way around. Sometimes we can get a little Stockholm syndrome from the technology and the processes that we live with. And sometimes the new technology can suggest new approaches. And if we maintain a grounding in what's important, we stay focused, right? If you're a board member or a president or a senior leader, stay focused on the metrics, on the goals, on the values that matter to you, and stay flexible and open-minded about new ways that you can achieve those more effectively and more cost-efficiently.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. This is going to change the way we work. We have to recognize it has strengths and weaknesses, but just like the wheel, we're not going to have to drag things. We're going to be able to roll things. And the question is it going to roll smoothly or is it going to roll over us?
We still, we get to drive to work, but we still have to go to work and do work.
Exactly. So what's next for you, Michael, besides doing our next experiment?
That's really what life is all about, isn't it? The next experiment.
It certainly is. So, Michael, I want to thank you for being on this show. This has just been a fabulous conversation for me, and I really look forward to our experiment. This is going to be fun.
I agree. I'm curious, too.
Take care, my friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Drumm. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening today. And a special thank you to our special guest, Michael Feldstein, and for his sharing with us his thoughts on the benefits and drawbacks of artificial intelligence and machine learning and how it can affect and help higher education institutions. Our next guest is Alyssa Sangster, CEO of Forte Foundation. Alyssa will be joining us to talk about the support that women and minorities need to ascend the leadership ladder in higher ed. Alyssa brings with her experience in both higher ed and corporate America, and I expect this talk will be enlightening for those higher ed leaders striving to improve their diversity in leadership positions.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.